Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, snug under the blanket of dusk, we find ourselves in a medieval village, equal parts mud, miracles, and mystery stew. The year is approximately 1347, give or take a harvest, a time when noses were considered well made if they'd never been broken in a jousting accident, and the local fashion trend was whatever's not on fire. Our first stop, laws. Not the boring kind that snooze in thick books behind oak-panelled walls. No, these were laws with personality, with flair, with an oddly violent relationship to cheese, shoes, and swans. Because in the Middle Ages, law was less about justice and more about making sure your neighbour Henry didn't smell too interesting on a Sunday. For instance, and this is very real, it was once illegal in some English towns to wear pointy shoes. Yes, your fashionable poulaines, those toe-wagging medieval stilettos poking out like weaponized barnacles, could land you in hot water with church authorities. In 1463, England's King Edward IV decreed that no one beneath the rank of lord could wear shoes with points longer than 2 inches. Presumably, this was to curb pride, lust, and poorly navigated staircases. Imagine poor Thomas from the tannery, strutting into mass with 12-inch toes, only to be yanked aside by the local bailiff with a measuring stick and a raised eyebrow. "Sorry, Thomas," the bailiff might say. "Those tips are for dukes. Your toes are committing treason." But don't think it ends with shoes. The Middle Ages also had a peculiar law regarding bread. You see, bakers of yore could be fined, or worse, for selling underweight loaves. In fact, the phrase "a baker's dozen" comes from this very concern. To avoid punishment, bakers would toss in an extra loaf or pastry when selling by the dozen, just to stay on the safe side of the law, and a safe distance from the stocks. Ah yes, the stocks. Not a type of soup, but a wooden frame where one's hands, or head, or feet, or general dignity could be placed for public ridicule. People could be locked up in the town square just for gossiping, wearing an offensive hat, or selling ale that was ever so slightly off. It was the medieval equivalent of unsubscribing to your behaviour. Now, let's talk about pigs. Yes, pigs. You wouldn't think a pig could break the law, but in medieval France, animals could stand trial. I'm quite serious. A pig in Falaise in 1386 was sentenced to death in full human trial for killing a child. The pig was dressed in human clothes and executed in public. This wasn't satire. This was Tuesday. Animals tried as if they were people, pointy shoes regulated like royal privileges, and ale measured like it contained royal secrets. It all stems from a deeply practical worldview smothered in ceremony. In a time before consistent rulers, constitutions, or plumbing, the law was often theatrical. It wasn't just a deterrent, it was a show. Many such laws were rooted in a blend of religious doctrine, superstition, and a very understandable desire not to be accidentally poisoned by an experimental pie. After all, without modern preservatives, one bout of fish pudding gone sour could be both your final meal and your final act of defiance. And amid all this, we return briefly to Brother Oswin, our ever-patient monk. He's in charge of copying laws by candlelight. His quill scratches across parchment, his fingers dappled with ink. From time to time, he pauses to yawn, or to glare meaningfully at the scriptorium cat, who is, as usual, asleep directly on the law he was trying to transcribe. Considering the amount of ink spilled on legal codes, We suspect that half of medieval legislation was actually just cat paw prints mistaken for divine amendments. Still, those sleepy scrolls carried the weight of baron and beggar alike. And whether it was banning too much garlic on Wednesdays or mandating the number of brewing days, each law told a story, not just of rules, but of fears, faith, and the funny little frictions of medieval life. And now, as our candle gutters low and the stone walls whisper cool air, the laws will rest for now, tucked beside tapestries, talismans, and the faint scent of honeyed barley. If your brain's still awake and your eyes aren't, go ahead. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Sleep gently and rest well. We've only begun to wander. Picture this. You're wandering through a misty English village sometime around the year 1370. The thatched roofs are slouched like sleepy eyebrows. The geese are arguing in the mud. And over by the village stocks, something very curious is happening. A man is being pelted with, of all things, bread. No, this isn't a carb-based uprising. It's just medieval justice in action, delightfully confusing as always. You see, during much of the Middle Ages, food-related laws were serious business, not because people were picky eaters, but because hunger could spark rebellion faster than you could roast a turnip. One such law, with eyebrow-raising implications, required bakers to sell their loaves by a strict weight standard. You sold a loaf too light, and you might find yourself fined, flogged, or, if your loaf was particularly nudgy, tossed into the stocks where bread justice prevailed ironically via projectile pastry. This law was known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, and it's not, sadly, a medieval dinner event. No, it was a sprawling legal document meant to stop food fraud, because back then, in a time before nutrition labels and unboxing videos, bread and beer were the two most essential food groups. If you tampered with the bread by shorting its weight, or sneaking in chalk, sand, or the occasional crushed bone, yes, really, you weren't just being stingy. You were tampering with public order. Bread was sacred. Beer was life. And if a baker undermeasured a loaf, they'd often toss in an extra to protect themselves, thus birthing the cherished, doughy tradition of the baker's dozen. One for you, one for the tax collector, one so you don't get bludgeoned by the Bread Enforcement Guild. But it wasn't only bakers who had the legal spotlight shining on their flour-dusted aprons. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer out of their homes, were under constant surveillance by something adorably Orwellian called the ale taster. His job? Taste every batch of beer brewed in the village, to make sure it was strong enough to satisfy, but not strong enough to spark an impromptu peasant riot. If a brew failed the test, the poor alewife might be dunked, yes, dunked, into a pond while tied to a seesaw-like contraption called a cucking stool. Imagine a public teeter-totter of humiliation, powered by community judgment and cold, algae-rich water. Still, consider the quiet brilliance of these laws. Every basket of bread and every barrel of ale played its part in keeping the peace. If food was fair and filling, people were just a bit less likely to march on their lord's manor with pointy sticks and uncomfortable questions about taxes. But food wasn't the only strange obsession of medieval legislation. No, there were laws far more specific, terribly specific, you might say. And one of them involved shoes. Yes, shoes. You thought your neighbour's Crocs were controversial? Wait until you meet the Poulains. In the late 14th century, pointy shoes, extremely pointy shoes, became all the rage among Europe's fashion-forward gentry. These shoes, called Poulains, had such elongated toes They often had to be tied to the wearer's knees, lest they flop around like deflated kites. Naturally, the fashion became a class statement, and just as naturally, it sparked a law. In 1463, the English government declared that no one under the rank of a gentleman could wear poulaines longer than 2 inches beyond the toe. If you were of lower status and your shoes dared to achieve a dramatic point, your fashion-forward feet were literally criminal. Why did this matter, you ask? Because visible extravagance was dangerous. If a farmer strutted through town looking like a French troubadour, people might start thinking class differences were silly. And that simply wouldn't do. So medieval law stepped in to regulate the toe length of citizens, lest society unravel from the feet up. Such was the way of the age, regulating bread, beer, and footwear with equal gravity and medieval bewilderment. Logical? Rarely. Effective? Sometimes. Amusing? Always. And just when you thought shoes were the strangest thing to regulate, wait until we peek behind the royal curtain, where laws decided whether laughter was noble or treasonous. In the pleasant muddle of medieval life, where turnips were currency, soup counted as a spiritual event, and everyone smelled faintly of damp wool, you might think the law existed simply to keep things from getting too weird. And yet, it often accomplished the opposite. Take, for example, the curious case of the pig trials. No, that wasn't the name of an obscure Norse rock band or a particularly avant-garde plate at a modern gastropub. We're talking literal pigs in court, standing trial. You see, in the Middle Ages, particularly in France and parts of Switzerland, justice was, shall we say, very enthusiastic. If a pig attacked a person, or worse, a child, it would be arrested. Yes, with chains and everything. A notary would file the charges. The local magistrate would arrange a full courtroom scene. And somewhere, probably in the dirtiest corner, sat the defendant, a pig who had no lawyer, considerable fleas, and absolutely no idea what was happening. One famous example occurred in 1386 in a small French town called Falaise. A sow was found guilty of attacking and killing a child. The trial was somber. The judge wore his full robes, officials recorded testimony, and after careful deliberation and an awkward pause every time the pig oinked, she was sentenced to death. Dressed in human clothes, no less. Executed publicly to set an example. To whom, you ask? Other pigs. One can only assume. Now, your sleep-brushed brain may be wondering, why? Why go through the trouble of trying an animal? Well, in the medieval imagination, crime wasn't just disobedience, it was a tear in the moral fabric of the cosmos. Bad behavior, even by livestock, could provoke divine irritation. And that was not worth the gamble. By trying the pig, the town was symbolically restoring order. Suns could continue shining. Bread could keep rising. And most importantly, people could resume blaming goats for everything. But pigs weren't the only ones blamed for bodily mischief. There were even laws concerning sneezes and snails. In England, one curious regulation in the 13th century stated that anyone who disturbed a court session, say by sneezing too loudly, could be fined a small amount of silver. It wasn't just about noise. A sneeze was seen as a possible sign of demonic interruption. And while today a sneeze might earn you a chorus of "bless you," back then, it might have earned you a legal bill. And possibly exorcism. Depends on the judge's mood. As for snails, oh dear. There was, in certain garden-forward communities, serious legal disdain for what they called creeping theft. If your neighbour's cabbage patch was infested with snails, and some of those gastropodial menaces migrated to your plot, you could press charges against your neighbour, not the snails. Apparently, medieval courts drew the line at putting a pig on trial, but not a mollusk. Which makes sense, really. Can you imagine waiting for a snail to mount the witness box? Still, these seeming absurdities stemmed from a sincere yearning for balance. In a world of mysterious illnesses, crop failures, and suspicious skies, people clung to systems that offered any kind of control. Laws, even ridiculously literal ones, provided that. If cause and effect could be carved into wooden legal benches, maybe chaos wasn't permanent. Maybe justice could be served, even if it occasionally involved dressing a hog in a bonnet. And so, next time you're halfway between wakefulness and sleep, and your dream features a gavel-wielding chicken or an indignant asparagus making its case in court, just blame medieval Europe. And as the candlelight of history flickers softly in the draft of retrospect, we tiptoe gently into the world of another legal oddity, one involving shoes, serpents, and the mysterious art of sumptuary laws. Let's drift back, quietly, dreamily, to a medieval town square wrapped in soft candlelight, where cobblestones remember the footsteps of long-forgotten laws. Some of these laws, while sounding absurd to our modern sensibilities, were once etched with startling seriousness into the legal parchments of the realm. And few are as delightfully bizarre and bizarrely practical as the law of the hue and cry. It begins with this. If a theft occurred, say a suspiciously fast-footed fellow departed your cottage with both your goose and your dignity, it was not just your problem. Oh no, by law, it was your solemn duty to immediately shout loudly, so loudly in fact, that nearby villagers would emerge from their thatched homes mid-supper or mid-chamber pot and join in a dramatic group chase. This was the hue and cry. Not a metaphor, but a literal yelling, where failure to participate made you legally complicit. Essentially, if there was a burglar and you didn't enthusiastically scream and start sprinting after them, you were the criminal now. Congratulations, new thief. Welcome to the guild. One couldn't help but picture the quaint absurdity. Someone snatches a loaf of bread. The baker explodes into the street, bellowing like an operatic walrus. Townsfolk pour out like startled ducks in bonnets and breeches, and suddenly, half the village is galloping uphill in their stockings, pitchforks in one hand, leftover mutton in the other. Now, this charmingly chaotic ritual wasn't pure medieval slapstick. The hue and cry system was, in its time, a creative attempt at community policing, cooperation by commotion. For back in the blissful pre-existence of professional police, the protection of your cabbage patch and grandmother's pearls relied mostly on communal pestering. The idea was simple, if not serenely inefficient. Deter crime by ensuring any wrongdoing instantly triggered a small village flash mob. It gets better, or perhaps more chaotic. You see, ignoring the hue and cry, even just to say continue knitting your socks or sipping your ale during the excitement, could get you fined by the 100. In medieval England, that was a hefty sum. Imagine the cost of 2 cows, 5 chickens, and 12 inconvenience complaints from your neighbour Wallace. The law presumed that inaction was guilt, or at best, suspicious laziness. And if you fled the scene while others chased, eyes might follow you with murmurs of thief adjacent, a damning social category no one wished to belong to, even if you were simply late to pig milking duty. Now, while this law may feel like something from a Monty Python sketch storyboard, it served one very tangible purpose. In the absence of surveillance cameras, 20 people shrieking and scrambling in ruffled tunics was the next best deterrent. Strangely, the hue and cry was legal proof that middle-aged villagers could behave exactly like caffeinated meerkats when the situation called for it. It wasn't just England, of course. Variants of the hue and cry flickered through the medieval laws of France and Germany. Although in France, crime chasing was often conducted with marginally more wine and dramatically more moustache. The universality of it suggests something remarkably relatable: the temptation of a good community uproar. Everyone wants to feel important and slightly dramatic all at once. Historians have often debated whether this law was genuinely enforced or more of a theatrical deterrent. But records exist, faded, ink-blotched parchments that tell of people being fined for failing to shout. Imagine the scene in real life: a yeoman standing solemnly in front of the local magistrate. "Why didn't you cry out, good Henry?" "Well, my lord, I had just buttered my toast. But a crime, man. It wasn't my goose." And so, a fine. Over time, the hue and cry faded into legal obscurity, replaced by watchmen, sheriffs, and eventually a fully professionalized police force. But what a scene it must have been in those dim-lit evenings, where the entire identity of crime prevention was based on your enthusiasm for hollering loud and chasing barefoot over cabbage patches. Now, let us tiptoe away from the communal cacophony and the slapstick sprinting. The night is still, and the villagers are at last back in their beds, hopefully reunited with their stolen poultry. Because, dear listener, our next moment in historical nonsense slips not into noisy chases, but into something whispery and wool-bound, something fit for a sheep, a scandal, and a suspicious lack of socks. By the flickering light of a medieval hearth, somewhere between the scent of damp hay and mutton stew, let us drift back into the velvet folds of European history. People in the Middle Ages had a gift for making rules about just about everything. Kings, clergy, town councils, even the baker, who had the audacity to sell slightly undersized bread rolls. And tonight, snuggled deep into history's coziest absurdities, we arrive at one particular rule that smells suspiciously like old fish. Let's talk about ale. Yes, ale, the medieval English comfort beverage, a mother's milk for peasants and lords alike. In a time before plumbing, refrigeration, or enthusiastic TikTok mixologists, ale was safer to drink than water. Even children sipped it with breakfast, because nothing says start your day like lukewarm, softly fermented barley juice. But with popularity came peril. Enter the ale conner, a figure so peculiar and delightful that he waltzes straight out of history's sleepiest footnotes and into our dreams, cloak flapping gallantly. The ale conner was an official inspector of ale, a position proudly employed by English towns from the 13th century onward. Their solemn duty to ensure that tavern keepers weren't cheating the public by serving weak, overpriced, improperly brewed ale. Now this is where it gets medieval. To verify the strength and quality of the drink, the ale conner used an extremely prestigious, very advanced scientific method. They poured ale onto a bench, sat on it, and waited. If their leather breeches stuck to the bench, it meant the ale was sugary enough to ferment properly. If they rose dramatically from the seat without resistance, aha, fraud. The malt content was too low. Yes, medieval quality control involved a man with a damp bottom determining the economic honesty of your local pub. Imagine the solemnity, a town gathering, a wooden bench outside the alehouse, a hush falls. The ale conner, perhaps named Reginald or Geoffrey, strides up, his backside a public servant's most valuable tool. The townsfolk watch with bated breath. A splash, a sit, a pause. Would he stick? Would he lift breeches with dignity? Oh, the suspense. Ratings were low, perhaps, but the drama, positively Renaissance. In fairness, this was not the only method they used. Tasting was crucial too, though that sounds far less dramatic, and weights and prices were carefully gauged. But let's not pretend the sticky seat test isn't the one history whisperers like us truly cherish. This law, like so many medieval oddities, was rooted not in silliness for silliness' sake, but in the very logic of survival. Ale wasn't just a beverage, it was sustenance. Weak ale equaled weak health, especially in towns where uncontaminated water came from a metaphorical unicorn. So cheating ale quality wasn't just greedy, it was dangerous. The ale conner's work was serious business, considered honourable. Some were even selected by parish elections, which I like to imagine involved mustachioed farmers whispering things like, "Aye, Bernard's to be trusted with the squelch test." But human nature being what it is, and the Middle Ages being what they were, some enterprising innkeepers found ways around the inspectors. They'd save their best batches for test days and water down the rest. Village gossip became an auxiliary inspection tool. Old Maggie swore her husband's Monday pint tasted like dishwater, someone might murmur. And lo, an investigation would ensue. Even today, certain English villages conduct ceremonial ale connings for festivals, where someone in tights pretends to sit on beer-covered benches for tradition's sake. This may not be how modern quality assurance works, but honestly, doesn't it sound more entertaining than audits and spreadsheets? As we pull the woolen blanket of slumber up to our ears, one odd truth remains tucked in the folds of history. Humans have always wanted their beer to be good. That's probably what makes us a civilization. Sumer had ziggurats, Rome had aqueducts, medieval England had ale conners with sticky trousers and uncompromising standards. And just on the edge of dawn's light, where another curious law waits to emerge from the mist, we drift closer to one of the most unusual medieval mandates ever passed in a village court, where mirrors became suspicious and owls were possibly involved. If you ever find yourself transported back to medieval England, unlikely, but dream logic is flexible. You might be inclined to take a quiet walk at night. The moon glows softly. The cobbled streets mutter beneath your boots. Maybe you're craving a moment of solitude or simply forgot your chamber pot replacement at the inn. Just one problem. In many towns, being out after sundown without a very good reason could brand you a criminal. Enter the curious medieval law of the curfew, which, believe it or not, doesn't just exist to ruin teenagers' freedom. In its earlier iterations, the curfew wasn't a time when mom said to stop playing with crossbows and go to bed. It was a legal mandate to literally extinguish all fires and cover the hearths. In Old French, couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. A charming way to tuck your entire village in and prevent it from combusting overnight. Fires were cozy, sure. They heated your home, cooked your gruel, warmed your weak ale. But they were also perilous. Thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls turned nearly every house into an enthusiastic fire starter. So after the evening bell tolled, a sound vaguely resembling a sleepy iron cow in distress, you were expected to dampen your hearth and extinguish most lights. Not for ambience, but survival. The Middle Ages had enough disasters already without tossing careless ember incineration on the pile. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with strange laws? Ah, dear dreamer, patience. Because while the curfew started with good intentions, as all bedtime laws do, it didn't take long for it to become creatively enforced. By the 13th century, some towns passed ordinances that classified being outside after curfew without declared purpose as a punishable offence. The world had gotten a bit more complex since the just don't burn the village down days. Petty, criminals and rowdy night watchers were blamed for every mysterious goat disappearance and village scandal. People began equating nocturnal wandering with mischief or rebellion. Imagine poor Thomas, an apprentice cooper who'd stayed too late at the tavern, lamenting his master's obsession with symmetrical barrel hoops. He stumbles home under the moon, quietly humming a song about carrots. Then suddenly, bam! Hauled off by the town watch for looking suspiciously like someone not discussing theology by candlelight. Tragic. And what if you were out late trying to escape something far more sinister? During periods of plague, the curfew was ruthlessly employed to isolate entire sectors of cities. Town criers would walk around by day, ringing bells and shouting things that roughly translated to "stay inside or risk exhalation by sword." People were encouraged, firmly, to stay indoors, not just because of the disease, but because anyone outside might be seen as spreading it, even if they were just chasing a particularly stubborn chicken. Of course, as with most rules, exceptions existed. Nobles could get late-night papal cake deliveries with little issue. Clergymen carrying important holy texts, or even just candles shaped like saints, could also pass freely under curfew. And then there were the thieves who thrived in the quiet curfewed streets, enforcing their own unauthorized extraction policies. Interestingly, the ringing of curfew bells each evening became something of a cultural lullaby. Townsfolk would hear the bell and know it was time to wind down, wrap up their woolen arguments, and cover the fires with iron lids shaped like flat helmets. Think of it as the medieval version of dimming the lights and putting your phone face down. If your phone could burn your house down just by being left on. In time, curfew customs became more symbolic in many places, a gentle binding of community bedtime. But in others, especially during unrest or under strict rule, it remained an unnervingly effective way to control movement, to monitor dissent, and yes, to keep fires from flaring into doom. And therein lies the medieval tendency. Take something practical, like not turning your cottage into a torch, and gradually dip it in a source of suspicion, social control, and mild paranoia. It's a dish they served regularly, often alongside lukewarm turnip soup and confusion about decimal points. So next time a modern curfew rolls into your sleepy town during a storm or snowstorm, imagine the echo of bells in the distance. Picture some long-gone villager smothering their embers with practiced grace, whispering goodnight to a pot of peas as the darkness envelops. And somewhere in the distance, another bell begins to toll, not just for sleep, but for the next curious chapter in our collection of medieval mandates. Picture the year 1348, England. The air smells vaguely of damp wool, mystery, and turnips. Now imagine you're a pig. Not metaphorically, but actually a rosy, snuffling little pig. You're doing your piggy business down a muddy village lane, snorting contentedly, when suddenly you're arrested. Yes, arrested. You see, in certain medieval towns, animals could be charged with crimes. Not in a whimsical, isn't that a funny idea sort of way. No, we are speaking of actual formal, wear a robe and call a clerk trials. Pigs, cows, goats, and even the occasional chicken found themselves dragged before medieval courts. Their crimes, ranging from the understandably ghastly, eating a child for instance, to the baffling, trespassing, breaking into a bakery, being of the devil. Strange as it may seem, this legal performance wasn't for the animals, adorable though their tiny hooves looked upon the witness stand. but served a much darker and very human necessity: order. You see, medieval law was deeply symbolic. Crime and punishment weren't just about restoring justice, but about satisfying a kind of moral theatre. If a pig trampled your vegetable garden, something had to be done. The pig couldn't just go snorting around like it owned the patch, so it was given a trial. A priest might be present, sometimes an official appointed to speak on the pig's behalf. That's right, a swine with a defense lawyer. The common folk would watch the proceedings, wrapped in cloaks and riddled with fleas, nodding sagely as a particularly unruly goose was led away in shackles. To them, justice had been seen. The natural order was restored. The world, while still dripping with plague and wild with superstition, made a certain kind of sense. But the legal oddities didn't stop with livestock. Oh no. Let us now drift gently toward a realm of legislation that might tingle as it tickles: sumptuary laws. These were statutes that dictated what people could wear based on their social class. If you were a yeoman, a sturdy salt-of-the-earth type, and dared to wear silk, that was not fashion-forward, but quite literally illegal. Silk was reserved for the elite, nobles, royals, and whichever bishop had the poofiest hat. The purpose here was control, both of the economy and the rigid class structure. If everybody could dress like a duke, how would anyone know who to bow to? Or who was allowed to carry a falcon, or own a squirrel dressed in a waistcoat? Sumptuary laws ensured the visual pecking order stayed intact. Your hem length, your sleeve width, your specific shade of purple, oh yes, especially purple, all told folks exactly how much respect or bread to offer. There was something oddly comforting in that era of chaos and codpieces about identifying someone's rank by the size of their buttons. Of course, some enterprising souls tried to cheat the hierarchy. There are tales of wealthy merchants, flush with coin, flouncing about in forbidden fabrics. But woe to the silk-wrapped baker or the velvet-draped candle maker. The punishments were swift and sartorial. Heavy fines, public shame, sometimes having your precious garments physically burned before your eyes. A sobering sight for anyone who'd just taken out a second mortgage for a fashion-forward cloak. Interestingly, and this is where the plot gently dozes off into the arms of irony, the kings and queens behind these laws seldom obeyed them themselves. Their courts were festivals of excess, filled with people clanging about in cloth of gold while nibbling roasted peacock. Meanwhile, the common folk could be fined for a bit of lace or a hat overly suggestive of ambition. Now slip slowly into the flickering candlelight of a marketplace at dusk. Chickens weaving through wooden carts, a man selling eel pies, a boy playing a flute very badly, and somewhere beyond, a town crier announces an update to the hat ordinance. No felt brims wider than 3 inches for anyone below baronet. Another town takes to measuring ribbons with a ruler carved from oak and inherited from a great-grandfather who once saw the king's garter. Strange laws, yes, but comforting too. They were wounds bandaged by ritual, nonsense used as glue to hold a fragile world together. Injustice cloaked in velvet rules that made the scary thing, change, seem a little more polite, a little more predictable. And as night settles on these quaint absurdities, let's turn our gaze toward a different kind of restriction, one not made for skins or silks, but for songs, music, and a curfew stricter than a friar's diet. If you've ever wondered which medieval law caused the most exasperated sighs from peasants and the most gleeful quill scribbling from local lords, allow me to introduce you to the seasonal absurdity that was the forest law. A regulation so bafflingly specific, It managed to turn an innocent squirrel hunt into a hanging offence if the squirrel happened to live in the wrong tree. In Norman England, shortly after William the Conqueror finished his dramatic entrance in 1066 and made all the locals learn how to spell chateau, something altogether leafier took root: the royal forests. Now don't be fooled. When they said forest, they didn't mean just a stretch of trees where you might go to lose your thoughts and find your dog again 3 hours later. No, a royal forest was a legal designation, not necessarily filled with trees. It could even contain farmland or tiny villages where bewildered serfs attempted to raise goats and mind their own business. But if that land was declared under the forest law, it officially belonged to the king's exclusive delight. And delight, in this case, meant two very specific things: hunting deer and looking dramatically sovereign while doing it. The forest law was a web of restrictions spun like a legal spider's trap. In these designated royal reserves, only the king, or someone very grand with a royal nod, could hunt. So if you were a commoner and spotted a plump stag wandering into your cabbage patch, you'd better act like it was a ghost. Even touching parts of a deer, such as antlers or a suspiciously venison-like cut of meat, could land you in court. Or worse, in a pillory being jeered at by people who still had dirt in their eyebrows from planting turnips. It wasn't just the deer that were off limits. The trees, too, were protected, which is wonderfully ironic when you consider that a large part of medieval peasant life involved trying to not freeze to death in winter. Under the forest law, even gathering fallen branches, or estover, if you're feeling fancy, could require a royal license. That's right, friends. Firewood had to be formally permitted. Needless to say, this law was about as popular as a wasp at a medieval wedding. The people subjected to it had their freedoms stuffed behind gilded gates, which they could admire from afar, but definitely not climb. Violations were punished in beautifully theatrical ways. Poaching a deer, that could get you blinded or castrated, or, if the royal mood was especially sour, executed. Though over time, the punishment softened a little. By the 13th century, you might escape death with just a hefty fine and the loss of your hunting dog's toes. Yes, truly. There existed a charming practice known as expeditation, where the front toes of dogs belonging to commoners were chopped off so they couldn't chase deer too effectively. It was the canine equivalent of issuing parking boots. One can only imagine the sheer bureaucratic thrill of the royal foresters, who patrolled the woodlands like woodland hall monitors. They looked out for illicit mushroom pickers, rogue stick gatherers, and the occasional squirrel bandit, issuing citations with the righteous glee of those who know the king's hedgehogs are safer because of them. Despite all this grim splendor, there's a humorous undertone in how broadly the forest law was applied. At its peak, nearly 1/3 of southern England was designated as forest, including, at one point, parts of London, which means technically carrying a concealed crossbow in medieval Islington could have ended with very uncivil forest justice. Eventually, the absurdity couldn't hold. Public resentment grew louder, or at least more pointedly muttered. By the time King Charles II took the throne in the 17th century, with more wigs than sense, the forest law had withered into irrelevance, but its legacy lingers like a royal deer spotted from the corner of a peasant's memory, majestic, untouched, and very much someone else's property. The forest law reminds us how kings dreamed of green dominions, rich with game and glory, while their subjects just wanted to grill something without being excommunicated by a squirrel. And speaking of dubious dreams wrapped in parchment, our next stop takes us to a place where clothing became a crime, and the wrong shade of velvet could land you on the wrong side of fashion. And the law, the rustling parchment of medieval law books, may seem like the dullest whisper imaginable, but hidden within those crinkly pages are rules so bizarre they could easily have been dreamt up by a sleep-deprived monk after one too many goblets of honeyed mead. Such is the case with the forest laws of medieval England, the curious legal codes that protected not only trees and animals, but more mysteriously, the king's deeply held desire to not be disturbed while hunting, or thinking about hunting, or perhaps simply enjoying the idea of owning an entire forest in theory. Now, to be clear, when we say forest, we're not talking exclusively about places with trees. In the medieval mind, the forest was not so much a place, but a jurisdiction, a legal bubble floated directly from the king's quill. It might include actual woods, yes, but also open fields, rivers, and occasionally an entire village that found itself inconveniently located within the royal deer's preferred stomping grounds. The forest law was imposed with the seriousness of a royal proclamation, which is to say, it was deadly serious and mildly absurd. These laws were designed to protect the game, especially deer and wild boar, so they'd remain plentiful for the king's personal playground of pointy sticks and galloping pursuits. And if you harmed the king's deer, oh dear, you could be fined, imprisoned, or, until public outrage caused a rare backpedal, even have your eyes gouged out. Yes, gouged. Because what better way to appreciate the king's forest than from complete darkness? But perhaps the most medievally melodramatic element of the forest law was that peasants living within these royal reserves were forbidden from owning hunting dogs unless they had their dogs expedited, which, in this cheerful context, meant mutilating the poor creature to prevent it from chasing game. This crushingly dark form of doggy disarmament often included cutting away 3 front claws or slicing the ball of the paw. The idea was to render the dog unable to either sneakily chase a stag or even dream of doing so. One has to imagine the royal officials watching out for overly enthusiastic terriers with the watchful suspicion of a man who's recently lost a venison pie. Weapons, too, were suspect in the forest. Arrows could not be too sharp. Bows had to be declared, inspected, and in some cases, boiled and eaten. Alright, that last part isn't quite historically accurate, unless someone got very, very lost in the footnotes. Still, not all forest law infractions were bloodthirsty affairs. Some were more scrupulously silly. For instance, simply gathering firewood or collecting fallen branches could invite punishment. Need fuel to keep your family warm during a snowstorm? Sorry, those twigs belong to His Majestic Majesty and his surely freezing deer. Of course, there were exceptions. The king could, in his magnanimity, issue letters of venison to his friends, essentially legal permission slips to hunt without losing vision or coin. Picture it, a nobleman waving his scroll like a backstage pass, while grim-eyed foresters recall last year's incident involving an overly persuasive squirrel and a poacher pretending to be a priest. These laws reached their most dramatic and least sustainable heights under the rule of William the Conqueror, who apparently liked forests so much he made his own. The New Forest in Hampshire was famously cleared of hundreds of homes and whole villages just so he could have a fresh canvas of chase-worthy woodland. The locals, understandably, were not shouting "Long live the king," so much as muttering "Long may he trip on a root." But the truly peculiar part? Forest law endured for centuries. Despite revolts, protests, and rebellious archery lessons conducted in haylofts. The tension between royal privilege and peasant survival played out generation after generation. The trees stood silent, the deer bounded blissfully ignorant, and the people learned to survive within the confines of an imaginary map drawn in ink and reinforced by antlered ambition. As night lowers its velvet curtain over the dreaming medieval lands, we leave behind the creaking branches of royal forests and the strangely polite tyranny they represented. Perfectly manicured, rigorously regulated, and faintly ridiculous. And now, with the moon climbing higher and the hunting horns quiet for the evening, we turn toward another law, this one concerning shoes, status, and the strangely compelling tale of the pointed toe. In the hush of a medieval evening, where torchlight flickered through narrow timber-framed lanes, and the scent of turnip stew lingered like a well-meaning ghost, a strange and rather pungent law governed the hearts of townsfolk, the outlawing of baking bread at night. Now, this might stir neither your hunger nor your curiosity at first glance, but allow me to elaborate. In parts of medieval Europe, particularly in places like 14th century England, nighttime baking was strictly forbidden, unless you held a specific license, or were apparently born with superhuman kneading discretion. Why? Surely the yeasty whispers of midnight loaves would disturb no one. But beneath the surface of this doughy decree was a deeper fear. Fire. In a time when houses were lovingly crafted of wood, straw, wattle, daub, and century-old wishful thinking, fire was not just a convenience. It was a ravenous beast always waiting for someone to nod off next to a hearth. Ovens were among the biggest culprits. Baking, particularly when left untended during sleepy hours, could turn a small cottage into a surprise bonfire faster than you could say fresh cinnamon roll. So, city councils and local lords, in their infinite wisdom and occasional paranoia, decided that if it was dark outside, it was far too risky to trust your average villager not to burn the place down while pursuing a pan of crusty rye. Better to let everyone sleep with sootless dreams. But like many medieval laws, this one evolved a lovely little side effect: the illegal bread black market. You see, bakers had a tight schedule, and a 4-hour yeast rise doesn't care what time it is. Those caught kneading after hours could be fined, pilloried, or, in some cases, required to provide their entire batch to the town as a sort of penance/community breakfast. And the community breakfast is where things got deliciously political. If you were a local alderman partial to a thick trencher of barley loaf, well, perhaps you overlooked the odd puff of flour smoke at midnight in exchange for a warm parcel delivered discreetly the next morning. A wink here, a stale bun there. Thus was born the subtle art of medieval small-town bribery, fueled not by gold, but by carbs. Speaking of which, some towns got clever. In places like Coventry and York, communal bakehouses were built, large shared ovens for the townspeople. These marvels of medieval cooperation not only kept the flames in check under the watchful eye of designated oven masters, yes, that was a real title, but also became social hubs. Imagine the proto-coffee shop, where women and men met while their loaves rose, exchanging gossip, grievances, and perhaps a little too much information about their neighbour's lazy son, who hadn't emptied the chamber pot in days. Of course, where there are laws, there are loopholes. I wasn't baking, one might say, while suspicious wafts of rosemary and roasted garlic curled past their thatched eaves. I was simply warming my cheese. And while we're here gently poking fun at nighttime loaves, let's not forget that bread, particularly the humble round of rye, was so essential to life in the Middle Ages that to sell it short in weight or size was a form of fraud taken very, very seriously. Enter the assize of bread. Now I know, assize isn't a word that slips into everyday small talk anymore, unless you're an eccentric British uncle. But the assize of bread and ale was a real regulation enforced with eyebrow-raising detail, starting in the late 13th century. It stated exactly how heavy a loaf should be, and priced it in relation to the current cost of grain. You were forbidden from swindling someone with a tiny, overpriced baguette, lest you find yourself paraded through the streets with your subpar loaf tied around your neck, a carbohydrate of shame. Naturally, many bakers began adding a little extra to their wares, just to be safe. Thus the baker's dozen became a thing, a 13th bun, not out of generosity, but out of legal anxiety. It's still with us today, hiding in a paper bag of warm donuts. So the next time you're watching the clock tick to midnight and considering one more nocturnal snack, remember that in medieval times, such a craving might have gotten you fined, shamed, or best case, forced to host an unplanned town brunch. Now, speaking of curious old customs, let's nudge gently toward another particularly peculiar law. This one involving amphibians, buckets, and courtroom theatrics. Imagine the cobbled streets of 14th century France. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the less welcome scent of, well, medieval urban life, which may gently be summarized as strong. Children play with wooden hoops, merchants hawk their onions with suspicious enthusiasm, and nobles parade in garments that defy both gravity and good taste. Now, let's say you're feeling a little cheeky. You've tied on your best hat, perhaps a fetching crimson number with a peacock feather, and you're prepared to make a bold statement, not with words, not with deeds, but by eating a baked good on grounds the king has not approved. Oh dear. You see, in medieval France, bread wasn't merely food, it was a matter of national stability. The assize of bread, though it may sound like a particularly stern loaf, was a set of regulations dictating exactly how bread should be made, priced, and sold. First introduced in England and soon enjoyed by the French in their own fussy fashion, it dictated how much bread should weigh, how much it should cost depending on the price of grain, and, this is the important bit, who was allowed to bake and sell it. The punishment for defying the bread laws? At minimum, public shame. At worst, a charming little spectacle known as the pillory, which was essentially a medieval photo booth with no flattering lighting and considerably more elbow discomfort. But bread was just the beginning. Let us now pivot from carbs to couture. There existed in many medieval kingdoms a series of fascinating, restrictively stylish codes called sumptuary laws. These regulations dictated what you could and couldn't wear based on your social rank. They were the medieval equivalent of fashion police, only instead of a stern tweet, you might receive a fine or even temporal imprisonment for daring to sport ermine trim above your station. Ermine, you ask softly, already drifting toward dreams? Yes, white winter stoat fur. It was incredibly in vogue among the elite, but if a humble tanner from the suburbs of Rouen started layering his doublets with forbidden fluff, that was considered a minor social apocalypse. These laws weren't just about preventing commoners from looking cozy. They were tailor-made to preserve the very fabric, pun acutely intended, of the feudal hierarchy. Because if your tax-paying shoemaker began dressing like a count, who's to say he wouldn't start expecting tables? We must now tiptoe, velvet-sheathed, toward another law that seems rather odd to modern ears, the prohibition of night wandering. In several European cities, including parts of medieval England and France, wandering the streets after dark could get you arrested, not because they feared vampires. Those came later in the folklore calendar, but because nighttime was thought to breed sedition, thievery, romantic entanglements between rivals, and other shadowy forms of rebellion, like poetry or philosophies. To ensure the peace, curfews were enacted, curfew meaning quite literally cover fire, from the French bu, couvre-feu. You were expected to douse your home's flames at a certain time and remain indoors, preferably muttering prayers or trying to read without literacy. Town criers and even church bells would announce it was time for the streets to be silent, and if you were still out past that invisible, fire-dampened line, well, I hope you brought a very persuasive reason. But I was just going to the latrine, you might protest. Then do it faster, the watchman might grunt in return. But let us slow even further. Let time melt like candle wax, because these odd laws about bread, brocade, and bedtime weren't arbitrary. They were feeble fences against the natural chaos of life. The medieval world, you see, held its breath every day between famine and riot, plague and pilgrimage. In a time when even a sneeze could presage doom, the unsalted crust of government tried to impose a little order. Strange laws were signals: who belonged, who didn't, who could afford velvet, and who must, regrettably, stick to wool. And so, before we leave this quiet corner of historical curiosity, picture a man standing beneath the stars, clutching a loaf too heavy, wearing a hat too fine, staying out past bell time. He is perhaps a little foolish, but in that foolishness, just maybe, a bit of freedom. Sleepy now? Good, because in the next hush-draped moment, we'll sail to a particularly curious corner of the law, one that smells faintly and suspiciously of fish. It was a quiet morning in the year 1349, and the pigeons of Norwich were blissfully unaware that they were moments away from committing a capital offence. You see, in the Middle Ages, laws were often less about logic and more about vibes. Some were designed to maintain order, others to control the peasantry, and still others, like the one concerning pigeons, mainly existed because someone, somewhere, had a very specific problem and the political clout to make it everybody else's. In towns across medieval England, pigeon keeping became oddly regulated. Why? Because status was everything. A pigeon loft high on the manor roof served as a rustic flex. Birds gliding over your fields meant you had power, and also perhaps a deeply unhealthy obsession with feathered things. These manorial pigeons were usually allowed exclusive rights to poop on crops, coo at inopportune hours, and occasionally get eaten when times got tough. The catching, owning, or, heaven forbid, eating of pigeons by common folk was tightly restricted, so tightly in fact that breaches of pigeon ownership protocol could lead to fines, or in one creatively punitive town, several hours in the stocks with pigeons tied nearby to mock you, which, admittedly, would be humiliating. The law that made all this possible stemmed from a broader notion: protecting the Lord's game. Wildlife, whether furred or feathered, was seen as the property of the landowner, and pigeons, with their aristocratically aloof strut and deep symbolic connection to ancient Roman table menus, qualified as game. If you were caught trapping one, your motive couldn't possibly be hunger. No, it had to be rebellion, or worse, envy. There's evidence that some particularly cheeky villagers tried to get around the law by taming wild birds and naming them things like Sir Cloxalot or Winston Fitzfluff. But the local reeve, the medieval equivalent of a combination tax auditor and neighborhood busybody, was invariably unmoved. A bird without pedigree was no bird at all. And so, the law served a very dark purpose, hidden beneath feathers and fluff. By criminalizing casual hunting, lords retained control over not just land, but what literally flew above it. It was a kind of medieval version of DRM, dove rights management, if you will. Sort of impressive, in a terrifying way. Of course, not everyone enforced these laws equally. In Yorkshire, during a particularly lean winter, one town magistrate famously turned a blind eye to a suspiciously empty pigeon coop, his own, after discovering a large number of roast birds mysteriously appearing at his neighbour's Sunday buffet. It's said he muttered something about divine bird migration and promptly changed the subject to firewood taxes. But in general, pigeon justice was serious business. There are records of royal writs demanding crackdowns on poaching gangs that specialised in avian theft. And yes, you heard that right. Medieval England had pigeon gangs. Not gangs of pigeons, though that mental image is delightful, but humans who colluded to sneak onto noble properties and pilfer prize birds under cover of darkness. To be fair, creeping across a moonlit field in a woolen tunic with hopes of kidnapping a wood pigeon gives off a distinctly low-budget heist movie vibe. Quite romantic, in a scratchy sock, barely subsisting kind of way. Still, there's something heartbreakingly poetic about peasants risking punishment for the chance to add protein to meagre meals. The law, cloaked in legitimacy, often served as a tool to reinforce class divisions. Hunger wasn't a defense. In fact, it was often the reason one found oneself at odds with the law in the first place. And so, across centuries, countless pigeons became unwitting symbols of privilege. Their careless coos echoed through manor courtyards, and their droppings fell haphazardly on the heads of those without titles. It's the kind of power move even modern CEOs might struggle to replicate. Nowadays, pigeons have returned to democratic living. You can find them loafing on Herald Square statues, debating loudly over dropped hot dog buns, no reeve in sight to break up the scuffle. But there, beneath the cracked cathedral stone, deep in dusty registers, lie parchment pages that once made their feathers felonies. And speaking of unexpected delicacies with legal consequences, the next stop on our dreamy nighttime journey involves a surprisingly passionate law about pie sizes, a gooseberry scandal, and one deeply offended medieval baker. Somewhere in the gentle crackle of torchlight and the musty scent of old vellum, there lurks a particularly bizarre medieval regulation, the law of the over-indulgent goose. Yes, you may rest your sleepy gaze on this oddity, and I assure you, I'm not speaking in metaphor. In 14th century England, especially in the rolling shires where noblemen spent more time hunting than legislating, local ordinances were passed to prevent peasants from overfeeding their poultry. You see, in a pre-refrigeration world, balance was everything. Too skinny a goose, and you starved through winter. Too plump a goose, and it was accused of being a false measure of meat, which, believe it or not, constituted a punishable offence in market towns. The logic, perhaps more marinated in cider than common sense, was that a bird over a certain girth threw off the standardized weight expectations for meat vendors. A rotund goose could, heaven forbid, rob the tax collector of accurate tithes. So, in towns like Norwich and oddly specific corners of Gloucestershire, goose inspectors, yes, real humans with actual lives, would patrol poultry pens armed with corded string and a measuring rod, checking the width of fowl. If your goose had outgoosed itself, you could be fined, or worse. not allowed to sell it at market. Now, this isn't to say medieval authorities had an axe to grind with goosekind alone. Our ancestors had a strangely skewed sense of proportion when it came to punishment. It was perfectly legal to throw someone into a dank, rat-populated hole in the earth for fishing on a Sunday. But if your pig wore the proper colour of ribbon signifying municipal ownership, you were golden. Speaking of pigs, and we must, for history insists, they too had their moment in the irrational spotlight. In 13th century France, pigs were known to be unruly urbanites. They roamed the muddy streets like pink, snuffling teenagers, knocking over carts, gobbling spilled grain, and occasionally, with an almost deliberate sense of vengeance, trampling small children. The response? Put the pigs on trial. This is not a fever dream. In several documented court cases, pigs were brought before actual judges. Witnesses were called, evidence presented. The pig, fat and usually unimpressed, would be sentenced, often to hanging. One rather theatrical priest in 1386 insisted the pig wear a little waistcoat for the occasion, because if you're going to perform absolute lunacy, you might as well dress the part. These things weren't anomalies. Rather, they were the byproduct of a world trying to layer order onto chaos with little more than superstition, hunger, and a handful of probably sleepy scribes recording all this with quills made from the very geese being regulated. And somehow, all of this brings us to the curious case of medieval sumptuary laws, the rules about who could wear what. If you were a weaver living in York and fancied, say, a crimson velvet hat to impress the village bakemaid, that could cost you more than your Sunday stew. Deep red was often restricted to the nobility. The logic? You must dress according to your station, otherwise society would collapse into a terrifying orgy of upward mobility and poor choices. These laws were applied with charming selectiveness. If you were caught in unlawful dye, they might simply make you stand in the stocks wearing a sign that said overly ambitious dresser. On colder days, that might even be a fair trade. But at the tip of all this, goose inspection, pig trials, and velvet vigilantism is a deeper truth. The medieval world, for all its rough edges and alarming fondness for ankle irons, wanted to maintain a sense of control in a precarious life. Seasons failed, monarchs frayed, and plagues played a tune that emptied entire towns. So they created laws, however peculiar, to give people something to lean against, even if it was a sign warning, "Ye shall not fatten thy goose beyond measure." The rain tapping on thatched roofs, the fire's ember glow, the whispering fields beyond the village wall. These were the security blankets of life. And the rules, strange as they seem now, were stitches in that blanket. Now, deeper into the mists of our down-feathered past, we wander yet again. For in the long corridors of medieval judgment, there was once a law about bread so serious, it involved shackles, shame, and a device called the assize. But we'll loosen our grip on that crumb trail next. It is the year of our Lord, a long time ago. The moon is high above the mossy thatch roofs, and somewhere in the village square, a drunk minstrel is arguing with a chicken. But tonight, dear dreamer, we venture past the paltry debates and into the shadowy corner of medieval law, where things tip from the merely odd, straight into the suspiciously scented. Let's talk about a law that, in its crooked little way, tried to clean up society, specifically washing, or rather, the command not to. You see, in certain corners of medieval Europe, public bathhouses were targeted by authorities, not in the noble effort to reduce infection or flood risk, oh no, but to cut down on what they termed moral filth. You might think, So they tried to stop the spread of disease. A modern interpretation. Charming, really. But back then, the reasoning was a bit more spicy. Bathhouses, with their steamy moods and tiled walls, had regrettably become entangled, shall we say, in the business of late-night companionship. They were less lather, rinse, repeat, and more loofah, gossip, giggle. The authorities clutched their rosaries in horror and issued laws to shut them down or regulate the festivities. In Paris, for instance, the Synod of 1212 declared that clergy were no longer allowed to visit bathhouses. This, quite obviously, was not because the priests had developed eczema, but because the venues had become, let's say, performance spaces for the 7 deadly sins. By the 14th century, across much of urban Europe, public bathing took a sharp dive, not because people suddenly stopped liking hot water, but because authorities feared scalding the moral soul of society. So laws began popping up forbidding certain kinds of mingling in the bathhouses. It wasn't the steam that worried them. It was what happened in the steam. And so, bodies became crustier, quite literally. Because with the bathhouses under suspicion, washing oneself became a moral question. If you were too clean, it raised eyebrows. A little dirt? Acceptable. A lot of dirt? Perhaps even pious. This is how cleanliness became slightly gauche, almost scandalous. Imagine a world where smelling like a cheese wheel was a sign of virtue. But things took an even funnier turn in 15th century London, when city authorities advised that barbers could double as bathhouse attendants. Because who better to give you a shave than a man standing in proximity to 50 gossiping townsfolk in varying degrees of undress? Local ordinances fined those who ran bathhouses without proper candle supervision. Yes, candles. That ancient fire safety nightmare and apparent defense against moral collapse. Now, you may be wondering, why all the fuss? Was it just about sin? Well, not entirely. There was money in limiting bathhouses too. Nobles and wealthy landowners began building private washing areas in their estates. Controlling cleanliness became yet another way to distinguish the lords from the masses. Laws driven by virtue had a habit of conveniently benefiting somebody's coin purse. There's a tale from Nuremberg, my favorite sort of name to whisper when you're half asleep, that features regulations about gendered bath times. Men and women bathed on different days, probably a Monday for men, ladies on Tuesday, and Wednesday for closing and general mildew scrubbing. A highly respected job back then. But this presented the question, what if a wife wanted to bathe on Monday? And so ordinances sprang forth with the legal energy of a tetchy grandmother, banning improper mingling near the hot pools. You could be fined a pfennig or two, or in extreme cases, be asked to sweep the bathhouse as penance. Ironically, with the fall of the bathhouses came the rise of perfume, an entirely new industry of masking the medieval musk. Suddenly, covering your natural scent was fine, as long as it smelled like imported jasmine and not lavender-scented gilt. So, with noble intentions and slightly less noble outcomes, medievals managed to wash away their sinful worries by not washing at all. It's a law that reminds us that cleanliness may be next to godliness, but in the 1300s, it was also dangerously close to gossip. And as the bathhouse doors creaked shut and the candles burnt low, we tiptoe into the quieter rooms of the castle, where laws no longer concerned who bathed when, but what you were allowed to wear while doing absolutely nothing. Not all medieval punishments were about chopping off something important. Sometimes they were about humiliation, spectacle, and occasionally bread. Enter the medieval crime of selling underweight loaves. Yes, in an age of dragons, allegedly, kings, and grown men jousting each other in tin cans, one of the gravest offences a baker could commit was giving you 11 rolls when you paid for 12. This leads us to one of the most enduringly odd laws of medieval England, the assize of bread and ale. It sounds like a particularly depressing music festival, but instead, it was a set of rules designed to protect the common man's carb content. This was not merely a food regulation. This was a matter of divine balance and crust-based justice. Picture a medieval marketplace, bustling with the rustle of burlap and the mild panic of someone discovering they just paid 3 farthings for a turnip. Among the cheese vendors and suspiciously dented cookware merchants stands a humble baker. He's sweating more wheat than he's selling, all under the stern eyes of the local ale taster and bread weighing constable. Real jobs in this context, just to clarify. Now, the law stated that bakers must sell loaves of a standardized weight. But since this was the Middle Ages and scales were more of a gentle suggestion than a precision tool, the issue was things got approximate, too approximate in some cases. To ensure the customer didn't feel shortchanged, and to avoid being publicly punished or locked in a device literally called the pillory of shame, bakers would throw in an extra loaf, the fabled baker's dozen. Giving 13 instead of 12 wasn't about generosity, you see. It was an insurance policy. Here, take this bonus bun. Please don't report me to the bread patrol. And yes, let's pause to appreciate that once upon a time, there were actual, real officials tasked with ensuring your scone wasn't 5 grams too light. It makes one wonder how present-day cookie manufacturers would fare under such scrutiny, probably with a cautionary dunking in a vat of lukewarm ale. But bread was no small matter. In an era where diets revolved around brown, crusty triangles and drinking water was a risky bet, bread was life, quite literally. A loaf too light meant a mouth not fed, and once people started rioting over crumbs, things could escalate rapidly. Thus, misleading measuring was treated a tad like medieval treason. Not quite beheading level serious, but not far off either. If found guilty, a baker might be fined, have their trade suspended, or, in more slapstick cases, paraded through the streets with a piece of underweight bread tied comically around their neck. Nothing says, learn your lesson, like being the bread-themed joke of the week at the village tavern. Meanwhile, ale brewers weren't off the hook either. The parallel part of the assize dictated that ale had to be sold at a reasonable quality and price. Reasonable, in this context, was determined by the ale tasters, valiant men and women, nobly imbibing pint after pint in the name of public safety. Imagine going to your medieval job interview. So, what makes you suited to being an ale taster, good sir? Well, I can drink 6 tankards before breakfast and only fall over on the second chicken. You're hired. If a brewer was caught watering down the beer or overcharging for a mug 1 degree warmer than a trout pond, they too could be fined. Or worse, have their barrels destroyed in a performative ceremony of frothy justice. Picture the heartbreak as gallons of lukewarm hope seeped into the grass, while the townsfolk watched theatrically. Of course, all this may seem comically over-regulated, but at its core, these laws were protective. They ensured that in a world teetering between famine and poor dental care, the working poor weren't swindled out of their daily caloric miracles. It was, in a lumpy way, justice. And so, the next time you enjoy a fluffy brioche or a free 13th donut, remember that once upon a crowded, muddy cobblestone street, a baker risked public shame, so that no serf was shortchanged on their sourdough. But not all medieval laws were about stale buns and disappointed tipplers. Some involved feathers, status symbols, and a strict colour palette, which, as we shall shortly see, turned wardrobe choices into legal minefields. In the twilight of medieval experimentation, there stood a law so oddly specific, so absurdly detailed, it could only make sense in a world where pigeons were political pawns and geese occasionally attended trials. We are in 14th century England now, a land of damp forest paths, ale-soaked thatched taverns, and heads warm with wool but cool with suspicion. You see, back then, the world took oaths very seriously. If you swore something, you better mean it, unless, of course, you had your fingers crossed or were a goose. More on that later. One such peculiar practice came from the Statute of Swans, a law that sounds made up by a tired bard craving attention, but alas, it was inked deliberately into the English lexicon of authority. In essence, owning a swan in medieval England required legal paperwork. Yes, medieval swan registration was a thing. You couldn't just have one flapping about proudly on your estate unless you possessed the right bloodline or paid the crown the equivalent of a fairly respectable barn and perhaps a goat with good references. Swan ownership, you see, was restricted mainly to the nobility, and swans themselves were considered royal birds. There was even a royal swan marker, a man whose full-time job involved paddling down rivers, branding swans' beaks to track who legally owned which bird. This man would likely have been the subject of many boat-related jealousies and 3 solid ballads sung in slightly off-key manners. And yes, branding the beaks. Every noble family had its own swan mark, which was carefully sliced or burned into the beaks of their birds. Imagine the family crest, now gently engraved onto an unsuspecting swan's face. If it sounds a bit much, remember, this was the same era where turnip theft might get you publicly shamed with a full onion stuffed in your mouth, symbolizing something, possibly loss of seasoning privileges. The swan laws reached such an ornate complexity that even commoners catching a glimpse of an unmarked swan had to report it, lest they be thought in collusion with a swan thief syndicate, surely one of the quieter criminal enterprises in history. Poaching a swan, whether for feathers or food, was seen as a direct offence against the crown, akin to slapping the royal hunting boots with a wet eel. It simply wasn't done. Now, lest you worry that the birds themselves faced all this alone, some laws were considerate enough to give animals legal representation of a sort. Enter the concept of the animal trial. If a pig committed murder, or more accurately, if it did what pigs sometimes do when pigs are left unsupervised near babies, it might be put on trial, formally, with a judge, witnesses, and sighing scribes. Geese might also be brought to court for being disruptive, or suspected of being bewitched. Imagine the scene. A goose honking indignantly on the witness stand, its beady eyes sneaking side glances at the jury, made up entirely of exhausted men in woolen leggings trying not to laugh while maintaining the sanctity of the law. Of course, these animal laws often had a darker purpose. They were efforts to reinforce the divine order of the universe through symbolism and justice, no matter how symbolic or misguided. If a pig could stand trial, it implied that sin could be punished anywhere, that no creature was beyond moral consequence. In theory, this was meant to make humans shake in their boots, possibly with reverence, possibly with confusion. Then there were laws not about punishing animals, but assigning them status. One notable regulation refused peasants the right to keep greyhounds. Why? Because greyhounds were noble dogs. They were tall and sleek and chased foxes with the kind of delicate fervour only the aristocracy was meant to understand. If you were caught with one and you weren't a noble, not only could the dog be seized, it might be exiled from the village or, quite dreadfully, have its feet mangled so it could no longer hunt. A gruesome practice, cloaked in legal authority and leather gloves. At Serhalt night, perhaps these same noblemen fell asleep to the gentle bleating of livestock, unaware that somewhere nearby, a peasant dreamt of a swift greyhound at their heels and a dinner of swan pie, served, of course, with a dash of treason. And somewhere downstream, the royal swan marker dozed in his boat, feather in one hand, carving knife in the other, drifting quietly toward the next bend in the river, where the law met water and where dreams swam silently beside the lilies. Just ahead, as dusk deepens and the air fills with smoke from peat fires and late turning leaves, we'll wander into another curious realm of medieval regulation, where garments were more than fashion. They were moral declarations, but we'll glide gently there like a branded swan through twilight reeds. But now we arrive at the town square, bustling with muddy boots, suspicious pies, and enough livestock to make modern pedestrian zoning seem like a utopian dream. And within all this glorious medieval clutter sat one of the most surprising and, frankly, sleepily amusing problems of the age. Hats. Yes, hats. More specifically, how to legally regulate who got to wear which hat. In the grand tapestry of medieval laws, sumptuary laws were a particularly embroidered thread. These were laws designed not to keep the peace or protect peasants from famine, but to make sure you didn't dress too rich for your station, or heaven forbid, look fancier than your social better. It was essentially legal cosplay with boundaries, and hats, dear listener, were a big deal. To the wandering eye, it might seem silly, but in the strata of medieval society, a hat wasn't just a hat. It was a walking resume. Your felt, brim, feather, fringe, or lack thereof could determine whether you were seen as a trusted knight, a respectable merchant, or someone who should be sweeping pig droppings off the tavern steps without daring to look up. Take, for instance, the English sumptuary law of 1363, passed during the reign of Edward III. Among its many commandments, it sought to enforce proper dress according to one's station in life. The nobility, naturally, got to wear fur, silk, and fancy French fabrics that probably made a satisfying swoosh when they walked. But the poor? Linen, if you're lucky. Wool, if you must. And hats. The extravagance of a velvet cap with silver trimmings was strictly prohibited if your land holdings didn't include at least one castle or an alarming number of sheep. What's interesting, or rather snooze-inducingly whimsical about this law, is that it wasn't enforced out of mere vanity. No, it had a darker economic shadow. The real purpose, to preserve the delicate hierarchy of medieval feudalism and to curb what the wealthy saw as dangerous upward imitation. They were worried that if a butcher could dress like a baron, then who would know who to bow to? Social identity was everything, and nothing shouted presumptuous peasantry like the wrong choice of headwear. In Italy, things got even more specific. Venetian lawmakers, ever practical and slightly paranoid, dictated not just what kind of hat certain people could wear, but how wide the brim should be. A brim that extended too far out suggested ostentation. Too close in, and you clearly weren't shielding yourself from enough sunshine to be anyone of note. And then there's the matter of colours. Purple, royal purple, was essentially outlawed for anyone except literal royalty. Dyes were expensive to begin with, but purple, it came from a snail found off the coast of what is now Lebanon. That's right. A mollusk dye monopoly kept an entire colour socially exclusive. The law didn't want Tim the Thatcher turning up in plum. It upset the natural order. Now what happens if you break one of these hat laws? Well, sometimes you'd get fined, sometimes shame paraded. In Venice, repeat offenders could even have their illegal garments confiscated, which I suppose was the Renaissance equivalent of the fashion police raiding your closet. There are tales, perhaps embellished by scribes with a fondness for flair, of men being forced to walk bareheaded through busy markets after donning a forbidden cap. Dignity, as you can imagine, was not allowed to follow. But what makes these laws truly lull-worthy, in a strange, historical loofah sort of way, is how fiercely people tried to get around them. Clever tailors would sneak luxurious linings into otherwise legal robes. Merchants would bribe hat makers to stitch noble designs just subtly enough. And the church? Well, they turned a blind eye, unless your hat got you accused of vanity, in which case, eternal hellfire. It's hard not to smile, nestled under your blanket, picturing some ambitious medieval baker wearing a slightly too plush beret and being scolded by a local constable with a hat shaped like a baked good. Ah, those were the days. And as the cobbled streets quiet down and the feathered hats are stored away for the night, we drift toward our next curious law, one that might make you reconsider your relationship with bread crusts. As the sun set gently over the thatched rooftops of medieval Europe, the still air carried with it the fragrant promise of roasted turnips and possibly questionable sanitation. It also heralded the slow enforcement of one of the era's most peculiar laws, the sumptuary laws, rules that tried desperately and with charming futility to tell people what they could and couldn't wear based entirely on their social class. Now, you might imagine a noble knight, fresh from defeating a band of local bandits, returning triumphantly to his manor, only to be fined because his tunic had just a smidgen too much ermine fur. That, dear listener, is precisely the flavour of absurdity we're savouring tonight. Sumptuary laws were the medieval fashion police, minus the sunglasses and catchy theme music. They were designed not only to keep up appearances, but to literally keep people in their appearances, visually reinforcing the social hierarchy, because heaven forbid a peasant should wear the wrong kind of hat and be mistaken for a viscount. Imagine the scandal. You see, in medieval England, for example, these laws decreed that only royalty could wear purple silk or cloth of gold. If a humble merchant were to drape themselves in such luxury, they could expect a fine, imprisonment, or worse, a sternly worded letter written in Latin, which frankly was punishment enough. And the rules weren't subtle. In the 14th century, laws declared that knights and squires earning under 200 marks a year could not wear velvet, satin, or fox fur, because nothing screams social catastrophe like a low-income knight flaunting fox. Meanwhile, in Florence, Italy, the fashion police took their duties very seriously. Tailors might be summoned to testify about a garment's construction. Did your sleeve have too many buttons? Was your hem scandalously long? Could your bodice be mistaken for a duchess's? These were the tribunal's burning questions. At first glance, these laws seem like an overzealous wardrobe audit, but behind the fabric and fur lies something darker and delightfully ironic. You see, the true purpose wasn't fashion at all. These laws were about control. They reminded the lower classes not just of their place, but of the dizzying impossibility of changing it. You may rise in wealth, but not in silk. A rich merchant could build a mansion, but they still couldn't wear crimson brocade, not unless they fancied a vicious public scolding or a rather embarrassing fine. And yet, people tried. Of course they did. Humans have always enjoyed a bit of defiance, especially when feathers and embroidery are involved. Some tailors developed sneaky tricks to bypass these laws, lining garments with banned fabrics so they only peeked out as a decadent surprise. One moment, you see a respectable sleeve. The next, oh my, it's taffeta. In fact, the more governments tried to control fashion, the more people found ingenious ways to rebel. Which brings us to one particularly charming loophole: funeral wear. Yes, in death, the rules relaxed. Medieval mourners were allowed slightly more luxurious clothing, under the solemn pretense of mourning someone's demise. This caused quite a lot of very dramatic grieving and suspiciously stylish funeral attendees. Some people even requested specific lavish outfits for their deathbed ensembles. One last silken middle finger to the system. But the most delightfully absurd aspect? These laws simply didn't work. People flaunted, cheated, and occasionally bribed their way into forbidden tunics. Enforcement was lax, inconsistent, and often unintentionally hilarious. There was, for instance, a documented case of a town magistrate fining a woman for wearing French lace, which she had inherited from her grandmother, only to discover that his own daughter had worn the exact same lace to a church feast the prior week. The case was quietly dropped, and one assumes many awkward dinners followed. And so, the sumptuary laws faded, not with a bang, but with a muttered, "Well, we tried." Over time, fashion broke free. Merchants began looking richer than the nobility, and eventually, wearing purple silk just wasn't considered social treason anymore. But the echoes remain. Tiny remnants of costume codes still linger in our offices and red carpets, in school dress policies and dinner party panics over smart casual. The spirit of the sumptuary laws tiptoes gingerly through modern closets, muttering disapprovingly about hoodies at weddings. So as you rest your head, imagine a world where your outfit could literally get you jailed, or worse, socially misclassified. And imagine the rebellious tailor giggling as he stitched a forbidden stripe of velvet into the lining of someone's winter cloak. Slipping gently into soft silence now, let us wander next into a realm where food itself, yes, humble, innocent food, was once so heavily legislated. Even pies had political implications. The air was thick with the scent of damp straw and overcooked root vegetables as we arrive now in the peculiar realm of sumptuary laws, a flavor of medieval legislation so niche, so fashion-forward, that it might best be described as a dress code with the power of arrest. You see, in a world without Instagram influencers to set the style trends, someone had to control what people wore, lest chaos erupt from a peasant wearing purple. That someone, more often than not, was a king who very much did not want his tailor's most dazzling work to end up wrapped around a fishmonger. Sumptuary laws were the medieval state's way of saying, "Darling, that fur trim is simply not your station." They were designed to keep the classes looking just different enough to avoid confusion or upward mobility, because nothing struck fear into the heart of a baron like a butcher's son looking vaguely presentable. In England during the reign of Edward III, whose sense of decorum was only matched by his suspicion of too much chiffon, the Statute of 1363 was introduced. This law dictated not merely colour and fabric, but even the way a sleeve might drape coquettishly over the elbow. A yeoman was permitted cloth worth no more than 2 shillings per yard, and his wife, she could forget about velvet entirely, even if it brought out her eyes. The rationale here was partly economic, partly moral, and largely absurd. authorities believed that luxury among the lower classes would lead, somehow mysteriously, to the downfall of Christian society, as if one too many feathered hats in the fish market would summon a plague of locusts. Not that sumptuary laws came without their loopholes. Many of the rich simply declared themselves gentlemen by sheer confidence alone, thus unlocking the right to wear broader lace collars, the medieval version, if you like, of buying yourself a blue checkmark. Others flouted the laws through cunning acts of disobedience. In Florence, where style was a matter of civic pride, tailors became magicians of loophole tailoring. They'd layer luxurious silk beneath coarse wool cloaks, so the splendor was for private use only, like champagne in a thermos. Technically hidden, morally ambiguous, fashionably triumphant. At their core, sumptuary laws were an anxious attempt to keep order by appearances, visual hierarchies stitched out in linen and law. The nobility wore golden furs because they were allowed. The beggars wore sackcloth because they had to. And anyone caught mixing the two could find themselves fined, jailed, or, most worryingly, escorted to the village square, where everyone would talk about them in hushed tones over turnip pie. It wasn't just about fabric either. In Spain, the Catholic monarchs at one point insisted on religious affiliation through clothing. Jews and Muslims were required to wear badges identifying their faith. A tragic prelude to future horrors, dressed up as legal necessity. In Scotland, the kilt itself was briefly banned in the 18th century. Not quite the Middle Ages, but the spirit lived on. Legislators believed that banning Highland dress would weaken clan identity. The result? A brief surge of utterly boring trousers. So why were people so concerned, you might ask, about what a blacksmith's daughter wore to the midsummer feast? Because fashion, dear dreamer, was not just vanity, it was a battleground, an embroidered front line between order and revolution, wealth and want, serf and sovereign. The laws were seldom effective for long. People, after all, are stubbornly fond of silk and rebellion, and cloth, like ideas, has a way of slipping through fingers. Every so often, a tailor would stitch defiance into a doublet. A cobbler would lace social ambition into a fine pair of boots. And someone, somewhere, would gaze into a mirror and dare to look finer than was appropriate. As your thoughts begin to soften like wool beneath warm hands, consider how entire governments once spent time, serious ink and parchment time, telling people not to wear crimson. Oppression by wardrobe sounds comical from our vantage point, but in its day, it was deadly earnest. Smooth your imagined nightgown and tuck in your mental cloak, because next, we'll be drifting ever deeper through dusty archives and odd ordinances, where even your haircut could be a criminal offence. In the chattering twilight of medieval London, where the Thames flowed sluggishly past soot-smudged timber houses and the city's gossip was thicker than its fog, there existed a law so specific, so oddly tuned to the daily hazards of urban life, that it could only have been born from experience. Preferably the kind accompanied by cursing, bruising, and a suspiciously loud thud. Thus we arrive at the curious case of the falling object statute. Yes, dear dreamer. In the 14th century, residents of London were legally required to ensure that the contents of their windowsills and balconies remained firmly tethered to the laws of gravity, or rather, to avoid defying them at all. This included, but was not limited to, flower pots, chamber pots, and pigs' trotters, all of which had, at one time or another, launched themselves from the upper floors of homes with surprising enthusiasm. This wasn't just a matter of etiquette. The medieval city street wasn't merely a corridor for pedestrians and the occasional pig parade. It was, in effect, the medieval version of an inbox. Everything important arrived via the street. Messages, news, fresh fish, and unfortunately, unmentionable liquids. For a poor soul peddling his onions below, an encounter with a wayward chamber pot was more than tragic. It was statistically likely. So, lawmakers got involved, as lawmakers are wont to do, and decreed via the Assize of Nuisance, a delightfully titled document from 1305, that residents would be held liable for any objects that fell from their homes and injured passers-by. This was serious stuff. If your flower box took flight and gave someone a medieval concussion, you could be fined or even imprisoned. The law was not interested in your horticultural aspirations. Of course, this naturally led to some creative workarounds. People began to affix their belongings with ropes, chains, and in one enthusiastic case, goose feathers and an unfortunate idea about wind resistance. Some townsfolk developed elaborate pulley systems that allowed them to hoist their refuse directly into the street gutter, an innovation that pleased nobody, especially those who still used the street as, say, a method of walking. In answer to this soggy dilemma, another law politely asked householders to wait until darkness to empty their chamber pots into the street, shouting a generous and considerate gardez-l'eau, French for watch out for the water, a kind of medieval courtesy honk before unleashing a bucket of fermenting regret. It's a wonder any hat survived the Middle Ages, but such laws weren't crafted purely from a desire to shame people with poor aim. They reflect a darker truth. Life in a medieval city was not only crowded, but fragile. One well-aimed apple core could end a vendetta. One loosened roof tile could ruin a reputation. These falling follies weren't just accidents. They could be interpreted as insults. An insult in a world governed by honor and the occasional dueling chicken was a heavy thing indeed. An unwatched window could lead to a lawsuit. A misplaced pail could spark a feud. And a piglet pushed from the third story, yes, this did happen, might just launch an inquiry by the local alderman. All to say, everything had consequences when gravity was involved. Interestingly, these early falling object laws are some of the oldest examples of urban liability on record, tiny pebbles in the long, winding river of public safety legislation. And they speak volumes about the improvisational brilliance of daily medieval life. If nothing else, they underscore the importance of looking up before walking under a window in 14th century London, or perhaps merely taking a different street altogether. So as you settle into your dreams, know that while we today worry mostly about email inboxes and delivery drones, our ancestors had to worry about cheese wheels, pigeons, and the odd boot descending from the heavens. And they did what people do best when faced with chaotic weather systems of their own making. They wrote laws, muttered prayers, and tossed their waste a little more carefully. And while the footsteps of the night begin tiptoeing across the cobblestone alleys of sleep, let us drift onward, toward a stranger law still, where fashion met punishment in a riot of cloth and consequence. Somewhere in 14th century France, under the pale flicker of torchlight in a drafty courtroom, a pig stood trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, an actual pig. A pink, guilty-looking one, hooves trembling on the wooden floor. It had allegedly attacked a child, and like any reputable member of Christian society, it was held fully responsible, under the law. Welcome, dear dreamer, to the world of medieval animal trials. You see, in the buzzing legal spirit of medieval Europe, the line dividing mankind's laws and the animal kingdom was apparently drawn in very foggy ink. If a cow trampled a man, a goat consumed communion wafers, or a bird started squawking unpleasant theological opinions from the cathedral steeple, someone was going to court, and sometimes that someone had feathers. These trials weren't just strange rural habits. Oh no, they were legitimate, highly ceremonial, and often quite expensive. Full legal proceedings would unfold, complete with judges, prosecutors, a jury often made up of concerned townsfolk, and astonishingly, a defense lawyer for the pig. Because nothing screams due process, like a fairly well-dressed man arguing that the sheep was simply misunderstood. Now you might wonder, were they serious? Yes, entirely. Tragically, perplexingly serious. The underlying impulse here wasn't pure superstition. Like many medieval oddities, there was a deeply rooted, grimly logical reason: sin. The dominant worldview of the time saw the universe as a web of divine order. Break that order, and you didn't just commit a crime, you unleashed spiritual chaos. The pig wasn't just biting a child, the pig was participating, albeit unwittingly, in moral disorder, which, in the 1300s, was almost as dangerous as plague. Animals were part of God's creation, and if one of them began acting, shall we say, unethically, the church, and thus often the state, decided it must be suffering from sinister influence, perhaps even demonic possession, which, of course, had to be addressed in court with appropriate solemnity and a very fidgety bailiff. Animal trials could end in execution, exile, or, in a few merciful cases, absolution. Some were even excommunicated, which raises intriguing theological questions about whether a rat could receive a last confession, or if a duck needed to repent before it was escorted out of town on a very tiny wagon. Domestic animals weren't the only ones in legal jeopardy. Pests and vermin were subject to group trials. Yes, mass legal notices were sometimes issued for insects. Consider the Swiss town of Lausanne. In the early 15th century, they brought legal action against a horde of pesky insects that had been destroying vineyards. The court issued a formal summons for the insects to appear. When they, shocking spoiler alert, did not, the ecclesiastical authorities excommunicated them. Imagine an archbishop lifting his hands and gravely declaring, "We hereby cast forth the caterpillars and denounce their wicked work in the eyes of heaven." And someone in the back saying, "Wasn't that cat the real problem? He's been knocking over wine barrels for a week." There is also recorded testimony from the trial of field mice in the 16th century. The mice were given legal representation. The argument presented on their behalf that the land was rightfully shared among all of God's creatures, and if the humans wished the mice to leave, they ought to provide alternative housing. You may chuckle, and rightly so, but these proceedings had a dark undertone. They reveal the lengths to which medieval society would go to impose a sense of moral structure on a chaotic world. Disease, famine, war, the people of the Middle Ages lived in uncertainty. Putting a pig on trial, however surreal, gave them control. It suggested there was a way to reckon with wrongdoing, no matter the source. On paper, it was justice. In practice, it was a blend of theology, fear, and a very misplaced belief in rationality. Still, I can't help but imagine one very dapper rooster, perched beside his velvet-cloaked lawyer, whispering, "We plead not guilty," and the judge, peering down, murmuring, "You look suspiciously smug, Mr. Rooster." The courtroom coughs, the rooster winks, a feather floats down. Ah, the peculiar comforts of bygone rituals, even if they involved barnyard cross-examinations. But this commitment to legal theatre didn't stop with livestock. In the soft hush beyond the fields and farms, the laws reached even further, into the stars, dreams, and the unexplainable. So settle deeper into your pillow, dear traveller, as we drift further into the strange logic of medieval laws, where the cosmos itself was sometimes called to account. When you think of medieval market towns, you may envision cobbled streets lined with warm bread smells, pickled eels in barrels, and an alarming absence of personal space. But amid the bustle of apron-clad traders and onion-voiced town criers lurked a silent battle against sneaky sales tactics. Yes, the grand merchants of old, beneath their velvet hats and voluminous cloaks, were not above a little chicanery when it came to maximizing profits. And so, as ever, the law politely cleared its throat, unfurled its parchment scroll, and declared, "Thou shalt not cheat, unless, of course, you're very subtle about it." One of the most curious medieval laws to emerge in this arena was the assize of bread and ale. Sounds charming, doesn't it? Assize. So quaint, almost like a cottage pastry. But in fact, this was an early attempt at consumer protection, established in 1266 under the reign of Henry III. The law dictated not just how bread and ale ought to be sold, but precisely how much one could sell them for, and at what weight. Yes, weight. You see, in medieval minds, a loaf of bread wasn't just food, it was a potential crime scene. The idea was this: flour prices fluctuated, but bakers weren't allowed to pass their rising costs on to customers by shrinking loaves or hiking prices. Instead, a loaf had to remain the same price, and bakers had to adjust its weight according to the market cost of grain, which is all very fair, until your loaf starts looking suspiciously like a puff of flour in a sock. So, did bakers rebel? Oh yes. And most rebellions were quiet but creative. Loaves were hollowed or secretly overbaked into density-defying bricks. One enterprising baker allegedly filled the inside with beans to hit the legal weight. Innovative, misleading, and extremely gassy. To combat this crafty loafery, inspectors known as ale conners were appointed. A conner's job was to quite literally walk around town, tasting ale and weighing bread. Imagine the LinkedIn profile: professional pint sampler and loaf weigher. A dream gig for the nosy and perpetually peckish. Ale conners were also known to test ale while wearing leather trousers. They'd sit on ale-soaked benches to see how sticky things got. The stickier the beer, the more sugar it had, and thus the more suspect the brew. It is perhaps the only job in history where sitting in a puddle was considered important scientific analysis. Failure to meet legal standards had consequences. Bakers who offended often faced a public shaming ritual. Being placed in the pillory, a wooden stock with holes for the head and hands, while townsfolk threw old cabbage, bad eggs, or dare we say, suspiciously light loaves. A kind of culinary poetic justice. Oddly though, the laws weren't entirely punitive. A clause within the assize demanded that bakers leave some bread and ale for the poor at fixed prices. In a way, it ensured that hunger didn't harden into despair, just slightly stale bread. Now, while bread was facing legal micromanagement, fishmongers weren't off the hook either. One law stated that fish should be displayed as in their natural form. This was to prevent fishmongers from doing something fishy, like substituting a cheap fish for a fine one. For instance, dressing up a humble whiting as if it were a noble pike. It's the medieval seafood version of catfishing and comes with slightly more scales. Meanwhile, law codes for butchers mandated that old, suspiciously smelly meat was not to be sold, nor freshened up with herbs and scent. A noble aim, but as anyone who's walked by a questionable food stall might know. Where there's a nose, there's a workaround. And in case you think these rules were all about food, it's worth noting there were even laws about shoes. Yes, shoemakers had to cut leather to an exact length, and deviation meant fines. The idea was to prevent cobblers from using shortcuts and charging full price for what amounted to the shoe equivalent of a biscuit tin lid. Why so much legal fuss over loaves, laces and lagers? Because fairness mattered, even then. Trade was trust, and long before nutrition labels or weights and measures people with little clipboards, medieval law was doing its groggy dawn stretch toward consumer justice. Of course, not everything could be so neatly legislated. Some medieval misdeeds were far weirder and far more personal. If you're warm and still awake, let your thoughts drift now toward storms, shamans, and the unspoken laws of affection. In the flickering hush of medieval evenings, when hearths whispered and roosters had long tucked their beaks beneath feathery wings, the laws of the land dozed no less diligently than the people who lived under them. Some statutes were ponderous and dreadfully serious, like declaring war or figuring out who was responsible for the neighbour's half-collapsed goose shed. But others nestled deep into the nooks and crannies of daily life with the strange intimacy of a too-personal bard. Take, for instance, the noble city of Chester in England during the medieval period. There lay a curious ordinance that prohibited Welshmen from entering the city after sundown, upon pain of death. A dark decree, and astonishingly specific. Even more remarkably, if a Welshman was found in Chester after the bells tolled night-time, the law permitted townsfolk to execute him on the spot. Now, before anyone reaches for their pitchforks or their fact-checking monocles, take solace in knowing that even in the Middle Ages, many of these laws were rarely enforced. But the sheer existence of them gives us a peek into the precarious balance between fear, politics, and the very human tendency to draw lines in the dirt. The Welsh-English relationship during this time was about as harmonious as two cats in a sack. After centuries of border skirmishes, rebellion, and one too many angry sheep stolen in the dead of night, English towns erected statutes as a kind of proactive paranoia. The Chester law wasn't alone. Many English towns had similar curfews for the Welsh, and even the Irish and Scots in other regions. It was tribalism with legal paperwork, a medieval version of keep out signs carved in cold stone. But lest we paint the Middle Ages as some totally joyless epoch, be assured that villagers found their own ways around such rules. A great many town dignitaries were more concerned with taxes and good cider than executing travellers at twilight. And so, local dialects mumbled exemptions, bribes were passed like warm bread, and the laws, though impeccably dramatic, often functioned more as cautionary tales than courtroom declarations. Elsewhere in the domain of absurdly specific restrictions, France presented us with a regulation so delightfully bizarre, it flirts with the surreal. In 14th century Dijon, there existed an ordinance that stated one could be penalized for singing indecent songs in the public bath. That's right. Strip down for a dip, and you'd best keep your ditties G-rated. The city's magistrates apparently believed that nothing dampened communal hygiene like an off-colour limerick. Now, the public bathhouses themselves were already lively hubs, equal parts cleanliness and gossip, with the occasional flirtation steaming through the air like rosemary-scented vapour. But the authorities feared that lascivious lyrics might lead to moral sud-sinking, or, put bluntly, soap-induced licentiousness. So out came the fines, and in went the censors. It is said that some bathhouses even employed musicians to drown out such scandalous verses with more wholesome tunes, like church hymns or lengthy ballads about turnip harvesting. Speaking of turnips, and we really should more often, consider another law that aimed to stop spiritual fraud. In 13th century Bohemia, there was an ordinance that strictly forbade anyone from posing as a dead saint. Now, this might sound like a law so obvious it didn't need writing down, but it was actually a response to a ballooning trend of false relics and pseudo-saints popping up like mushrooms after a good drizzle. Con artists, always the medieval entrepreneurs, would sometimes dress as canonized figures, claiming to be visited by holy spirits, or sprouting the occasional spontaneous stigmata, which seems like poor timing all around. Monasteries grew suspicious. Pilgrims began showing up in peculiar towns to visit St. Geoffrey, the extremely newly dead, who conveniently resembled the local baker with a bedsheet over his head. So the law had to step in, decreeing that one may no longer pretend to be sanctified unless appropriately verified by Rome, or at the very least, not so obviously faking a halo with a gold-painted embroidery hoop. And with that, the medieval universe drifted back to bed. The bath singers hushed, the Welsh travellers found discreet lodging outside the walls, and the counterfeit saints, having shed their bedsheets, quietly returned to selling apples in the market square. Tomorrow, we'll open the last old dusty scroll in this peculiar legal saga. But for now, let these ancient laws, strange as they were, weave themselves gently into your dreams. And so, under the flickering torchlight of a medieval village gone muffled with sleep, we reach the last and perhaps most curious law of them all. Curiouser even than a pig on trial or a hat tax by royal decree. Picture it. The year is somewhere in the shadowy half of the 14th century, and in Chester, England, a town known for its Roman walls, slouchy alleyways, and slightly suspicious baked goods, there was an ordinance so specific, so oddly aggressive, that it seems like someone had to be deeply personally wronged for it to even exist. The law stated that if a Welshman were found within the city walls of Chester, after the sun had set, he was to be decapitated on sight. Charming, isn't it? Now, lest you think medieval officials were just handing out capital punishment like tavern napkins, let's gently lay the historical quilt over this one. For centuries, relations between the English and the Welsh were strained, to say the least, particularly after Edward I's conquest of Wales in the late 13th century. The simmering tension between subjugated populations and their conquerors wasn't quite the cozy neighbourly banter we might hope for today. So the law wasn't just about a bad night out. It was a method of control, of fear, an edge weapon sheathed in legislation. It was also, if we're being historically honest, utterly impractical. Not only did it ignore the fluid reality of who lived where and when, but it also enlisted gatekeepers and guards into a sort of nocturnal game of behead the local, which, if you're familiar with the average English guard's attention span after 8 o'clock, was not a recipe for success. Eventually, like all laws written in a stress-induced flourish, it faded away, likely ignored, probably mocked, and perhaps even forgotten by the very men who once enforced it. But its existence lingers like a whisper, a warning of what laws become when fear is passed as policy. And dear listener, lest we take comfort in the idea that unjust laws are a medieval relic, remember, even today, a few dusty rules remain trapped in legal cobwebs, like laws forbidding the carrying of ice cream cones in your back pocket or walking a cow down Main Street on Sundays. The bones of the past lie beneath the skin of the present, sometimes obvious, sometimes buried, but always clicking softly beneath our feet. But don't worry, we're not heading into the present just yet. Before we say goodnight to this parchment-thin book of medieval oddities, may I offer one last dreamy morsel? Somewhere in the silent stillness of medieval France, a certain bishop once decreed that wearing shoes with excessively long, pointy toes was a sin of pride. Yes, truly. The fashionably elite, desperate to keep their poulains pointing nearly a foot ahead of their feet, tiptoed around with curled discomfort, all for vanity and status. But the church declared war on pointy footwear. And so, in sermons across the land, priests warned of the dangers of devilish shoes that curved toward moral ruin. Some cities went so far as to ban them outright, not because of tripping hazards or fashion crimes, but because of what long toes said about a man's soul. Imagine that, sent to purgatory for your pumps. So perhaps there, nestled between laws of larcenous pigs and post-sunset prejudices, we find the quiet heart of medieval legislation. Not just control, not just convenience, but a deep and sometimes absurd desire to put order to chaos, to hold a teetering world steady under divine supervision, even if it meant arresting a hedgehog for witchcraft or measuring morality by shoe length. Strange, dark, but always human. And now, gentle listener, with our candle burning low and the town criers all asleep beneath starlit roofs, let us curl back under the woven wool of modern comfort. The laws are quieter now, the night's less watchful, and your pillow, blessedly, enforces no curfews. Close your eyes and let your thoughts drift away like parchment in a kind wind. History may be full of odd rules and darker purposes, but here, in this moment, there's only peace. Good night, and dream softly.